The night shift at the old municipal library was a job that few wanted and even fewer could handle. For Sarah, it was supposed to be a temporary gig, a way to pay rent while she worked on her graduate thesis. The library itself was a relic, a grand building from the early 1900s with tall, arched windows, ornate woodwork, and a vast collection of books that stretched back centuries. By day, it was a haven for students, researchers, and history buffs, but at night, the building took on a different character entirely. Sarah's responsibilities were simple: patrol the floors every hour, ensure no unauthorized persons were inside, and respond to any alarms or emergencies. The security system was outdated, relying on a few cameras placed in key areas, but the staff swore that the building was safe, at least in terms of theft or vandalism. The first few weeks went by without incident. Sarah settled into a routine, making her rounds, sipping coffee from a thermos, sometimes sneaking a novel from the staff library to read during slow hours. The building, despite its age, felt quiet and serene at night. Occasionally, the old pipes would groan or a loose window would rattle in the wind, but nothing out of the ordinary. One evening around midnight, Sarah was doing her hourly walk through the East Wing, a section of the library that housed rare manuscripts and first editions. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and polished wood. As she passed the glass display cases, her footsteps echoed in the empty hall. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the far end of the corridor near the archives room. "Hello?" she called out, her voice steady despite the sudden chill creeping up her spine. No answer. Shrugging it off as the building settling, or perhaps a stray voice from a night janitor, she continued her patrol. But as she rounded the corner toward the main reading room, the whisper came again, louder this time. It sounded like a soft plea, fragmented words, almost desperate. Sarah's heart quickened. She glanced at her watch, 12:07 a.m. She stopped and listened, but the corridor was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the old fluorescent lights overhead. Later that night, back in the security office, she reviewed the camera footage from the East Wing. Around 12:05 a.m., the cameras showed a faint shadow moving past the archive entrance, but no person was visible. She frowned. The shadow was vague, almost like a trick of light. The following nights brought more strange occurrences. Doors she was sure she'd locked would be slightly ajar when she passed by. Footsteps echoed down empty halls. Books were sometimes found misplaced on shelves, though no one else was scheduled to be in the building. One particularly cold night, Sarah was walking past the basement entrance when she heard a low moan, a sound of pain or sorrow. The basement was off limits after dark due to structural issues, and the janitorial staff warned her never to go down there alone. But the sound was compelling, human. With trembling hands, she radioed the security office. "Anyone else hear that?" No response. Summoning courage, she cracked open the heavy basement door. A blast of cold air rushed out, smelling of damp concrete and mildew. She shone her flashlight down the stairs, but the beam revealed only darkness. The moaning stopped abruptly. She closed the door and locked it, heart pounding. That night, she barely slept. The next morning, she asked the librarian about the basement. "It used to be a morgue," the librarian said quietly, "back before they moved the city hospital. Some say the spirits never left." Sarah shivered. The stories made her think of the whispers, the shadows. One night, while making her rounds in the rare books room, Sarah noticed a book lying open on a desk. It was an old ledger, yellowed with age, filled with names and dates. As she flipped through, she saw entries of people who had worked or lived nearby over the last century. Among the names was a woman called Mary, who had been a librarian in the 1920s. According to the notes, Mary had died suddenly in the library, and reportedly after locking herself in the basement for hours. Sarah felt a cold draft as she read. That night, the whispers returned, this time clearer. "Help me." Sarah froze. "Who's there?" she called out, voice shaking. No answer. The lights flickered. She hurried to the security office, locking the door behind her. But the radio on the desk crackled to life, emitting a faint, sorrowful melody, a lullaby she couldn't place. The sound filled the room, growing louder, surrounding her. Panic set in. She grabbed her coat and bolted for the exit. Outside, the cold night air never felt so welcome. Over the next weeks, Sarah researched Mary and found more disturbing details. Some believed Mary's spirit haunted the library, trapped in the basement where she had died. Determined to face the mystery, Sarah arranged to explore the basement with permission during the day. As she descended the crumbling stairs, she felt an overwhelming sadness. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with despair. In a dark corner, she found a small, rusted box containing letters and a faded photograph of Mary. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She left the box on the table and said a silent prayer. After that day, the strange happenings lessened. The whispers stopped, the shadows faded. Sarah finished her contract, but the memories stayed with her. The night the library seemed alive with stories not written in any book. Sometimes, when she passed by the building in the daylight, she swore she saw a figure at the window, watching, waiting. Story the end. The first time I worked a night shift, I thought it would be a simple job. Just some quiet hours, keeping an eye on an empty office building. The company was one of those small startups that rented out a floor in a mostly deserted tower downtown. My role was security guard, but honestly, the place was so empty, it felt more like babysitting a ghost. I was young then, 22, fresh out of college, needing some cash. The shifts were 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and most nights were uneventful. Sometimes I would do my rounds, checking doors and windows, making sure no one was sneaking in, but most of the time I sat at the front desk watching the security cameras or scrolling on my phone. The building itself was old, built in the late 70s, with that cold institutional feel, gray carpets, dull fluorescent lights, and an endless maze of identical corridors. The elevators sometimes groaned or stopped on floors where no one was supposed to be. It was eerie, but nothing I couldn't handle. About 2 weeks into the job, I noticed something strange. It started with small things. A shadow out of the corner of my eye, a door closing softly on its own, or an unexplained draft in a windowless hallway. At first, I blamed it on the building settling or the HVAC system cycling. One night around 1 a.m., I was doing my usual patrol on the 7th floor when I heard what sounded like whispering. It was faint and indistinct, as if coming through the walls. I paused, trying to locate it. The floor was supposed to be empty, and I was the only person there. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" But no reply, just silence and the faint sound of whispering that stopped as suddenly as it started. I shook my head and chalked it up to my imagination. A few nights later, things escalated. I was making my rounds near the stairwell between the 7th and 8th floors when I felt an overwhelming chill. My breath was visible in the air even though the heating was on full blast. Then, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, heavy steps matching my pace exactly. I turned around sharply, flashlight sweeping the dark corridor, but no one was there. The footsteps stopped. My heart hammered as I hurried down the stairs to the 6th floor. Later, I checked the security cameras. Nothing. No one on the stairwell. But the feeling stayed with me. That night, I couldn't sleep at all, tossing and turning until the sun rose. About a month in, my shift partner, a guy named Dave, told me he'd had similar experiences. He was more skeptical, but admitted that sometimes the cameras would pick up strange distortions, glitches that looked like shadows moving too fast, or figures that vanished the moment someone approached. One night, we were reviewing footage when the screen flickered, and a figure appeared on the 5th floor hallway camera, a tall man in a long coat, standing perfectly still. We checked the floor the next day. No one had access, no records of anyone being on that floor at night. After that, our routine became tense. We always stuck together, walking in pairs during patrols, flashlights ready. But the building seemed to fight us back. Lights flickered, alarms went off for no reason, and the air grew heavy and cold. The strangest event happened around 3 a.m., 3 weeks before I quit. We were doing a full sweep of the 8th floor, a storage area filled with filing cabinets and old office furniture. Dave was checking a door at the end of the hall when suddenly it slammed shut with a deafening bang. We rushed over, trying the handle. It was locked tight from the inside. "Who's in there?" Dave called out. No response. We tried to open the door with a key, but it jammed. Suddenly, the lights flickered off. In the pitch black, we heard a woman's voice. It was faint but unmistakable, a soft, desperate whisper. "Help me." We froze, unsure what to do. Then the voice stopped. The door rattled violently, as if someone or something was trying to get out. Finally, the lights came back on. The door was unlocked. We threw it open, but no one was inside. No sign of anyone ever being there. From that moment, we both knew something was wrong with the building. The final straw came a few nights later. I was alone. Dave had called in sick. At 2 a.m., the building went into lockdown mode. All the doors sealed shut. The elevators stopped working. I was trapped inside. Then I heard footsteps, slow and heavy, coming up the stairs toward my post on the 7th floor. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, but the radio was dead. I called out, but no answer. Suddenly, the lights went out again. In the darkness, I saw a figure standing at the end of the hall. A tall man, pale face obscured, eyes glowing faintly. I ran toward the stairwell and pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The figure moved closer. I screamed, and then the lights flickered back on. The doors unlocked. I bolted out of the building, vowing never to return. I quit the next day. No one believed me. The building was eventually sold and demolished. But sometimes late at night, I still hear those whispers. Story the end. The warehouse was always a different place at night. I worked the third shift for nearly 2 years at a big logistics center in the outskirts of a mid-sized city. The kind of job where you're alone for hours, the hum of machines your only company. I never expected that working nights would come with any kind of real horror, but after a while I understood just how wrong I was. The place was massive, with endless rows of shelves stacked high with boxes. The ceilings stretched up so far you could barely see the fluorescent lights that flickered overhead. Most of the time, only a handful of people worked the night shift. Me, a couple of forklift operators, a security guard, and a supervisor who checked in periodically. The rest of the company came and went with the daylight. At first, nights were just long and boring. You'd scan packages, load pallets, and try not to fall asleep. But slowly, things started to feel off. It wasn't the usual creaks and groans of an old building settling. It was different. The air felt heavier, the shadows deeper. The first real strange thing happened about a month in. I was finishing up a pallet near the back of the warehouse when I heard a crash. It sounded like metal falling over. I dropped the box I was holding and looked around. Nobody else was near me, and the forklifts were parked. I walked toward the noise and found a steel shelf had buckled with a few empty boxes on the ground. But there wasn't anyone around, and no forklifts had moved recently. I told the supervisor when she came by, but she just shrugged it off, said old buildings make noises. A few nights later, I was working by myself in one of the aisles when I heard footsteps behind me. Quick, light steps like someone was running. I turned around, but there was no one there. The only other workers were in the far corner, and the cameras didn't show any movement. I shrugged it off as fatigue, but the footsteps came again. That night, they echoed around me, always close but never visible. Sometimes they circled me. Once, I heard a voice whisper my name. One night, the lights in one aisle flickered on and off repeatedly. I went to fix a light bulb, but found no access panel or anything that could cause the flicker. It was just the lights. On another occasion, I was near the loading docks when I saw a shadow move across the far wall. I called out to the security guard, but he wasn't anywhere near the docks. The cameras didn't pick up anything. By now, I was getting seriously creeped out. I started noticing things out of place. Boxes I hadn't touched moved, pallets shifted slightly. Even my personal belongings sometimes disappeared for a few minutes, only to reappear later in random spots. One of the forklift drivers, an older guy named Jerry, told me that years ago, before the company took over, the building was a factory and that there had been a serious accident there. A worker fell from a platform and died. He said some nights you could feel the presence of that man, restless. That explained a lot, but it didn't make the things stop. The worst night was about 2 months after I started. The night was cold and the warehouse was nearly empty. I was closing down one of the sections, putting away the last few items when the lights went out completely. Backup generators kicked in, but everything felt off. The emergency lights gave everything an eerie orange glow. Then I heard the screams. They weren't loud, but they were clear. A woman's scream, terrified and desperate, echoing through the aisles. I dropped everything and called for the supervisor on the radio, but there was no response. I walked cautiously toward the sound, heart pounding. The scream came again, this time closer, coming from the storage area. When I reached the spot, it was empty, no one around. but I noticed a wet spot on the floor that looked like fresh blood. I called the security guard, who came immediately, but he was spooked and insisted we leave that part of the warehouse alone. The next day, the place was spotless, no sign of any blood or disturbance. I told a few coworkers about it, but they said I must have been imagining things or it was just an animal trapped somewhere. I left the job a week later. Years later, I still think about those nights, about the footsteps, the whispers, the shadows that moved without source. I know what I saw and heard wasn't just fatigue or imagination. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I swear I still hear those footsteps following me. Story, the end. Working the night shift at the manufacturing plant wasn't something I initially planned on doing long term. I just graduated college and needed a job, any job, and this one was hiring immediately. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady and the hours were consistent, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I thought the quiet and solitude might be nice. I was wrong. The plant itself was huge, old brick buildings cobbled together over decades, with conveyor belts, stamping machines, and assembly lines everywhere. The day shift crew handled most of the production, but the night shift was there to keep everything running, perform maintenance, and ensure the machines didn't break down. My role was to monitor the plant floor, report any mechanical issues, and handle security rounds. From the start, I was alone during my shifts. The only other person on site was the maintenance guy, a grizzled veteran named Paul, who came in around 1 a.m. and stayed until the morning. He was friendly but didn't talk much. We'd nod hello, exchange the bare minimum, and that was it. The first week was uneventful. I got used to walking the long aisles between the machines, checking gauges, listening to the whirs and clanks of heavy industry. The place felt cavernous and echoey at night. The only light came from overhead fluorescents that buzzed with varying intensity. The smell of oil and metal was thick in the air. Then the noises started. One night, just after midnight, while I was doing a security check near the West Wing, I heard a tapping sound. It was soft at first, like someone lightly drumming their fingers on metal. I paused, turning toward the sound. It seemed to be coming from the large stamping machine at the far end of the aisle. I called out, "Hello? Maintenance?" But the plant was empty except for me, so no reply. The tapping continued, rhythmic, deliberate, but no one was there when I approached. The machine was powered down, locked out for the night, but the tapping persisted. I told myself it was just a loose panel or something knocking in the wind. The next night, it was louder and closer. This time, the tapping was accompanied by a faint shuffling sound, like footsteps but without any weight or impact. When I walked toward the sound, it stopped abruptly. I checked the security cameras in the control room, watching the aisles, but nothing showed on the monitors except the empty factory floor. Paul was on shift that night and laughed when I told him. "Old buildings make noises," he said. "Steel expands and contracts. You get used to it." But I wasn't used to it. A week later, around 3 a.m., the plant's power flickered and went out for a full minute. Emergency lights kicked on, casting red glows and shadows that danced against the machines. I was standing near the east wing when it happened, alone. When the power returned, I noticed the stamping machine's panel was open, even though I was sure I'd locked it the night before. I closed it, but the eerie feeling stayed. On my rounds, I also started noticing the smell, something like burnt rubber mixed with something foul. The HVAC filters were clean and the ventilation system was running, but that smell hung in the air near the stamping machine. Then came the footsteps. They weren't human footsteps. They were too heavy, too uneven. They sounded like someone wearing boots, stomping with a purpose, but the steps were sometimes too fast, sometimes too slow, and always echoed in places where no one could be. One night, I was heading to the break room on the opposite end of the plant when I heard the steps behind me. At first, I thought it was Paul, but when I turned around, no one was there. The footsteps stopped right as I did, and after a moment, they started again, retreating down the hallway. I started carrying a small flashlight and a pocket knife after that. The scariest moment came on a Thursday night about 2 months into the job. I was finishing my rounds near the stamping machine around 4 a.m. when I heard a voice. It was low, raspy, and barely audible, but it said my name clearly. "Jason." I froze, heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called out. No answer. I grabbed my radio and tried to contact Paul, but there was no response. The radio crackled, then went dead. I stepped closer to the stamping machine and shined my flashlight on it. The panel was open again, swinging slightly, as if it had been disturbed recently. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the machines whined to life on their own. The stamping machine started up, slamming metal into metal with deafening force. I jumped back, heart racing, and hit the emergency stop button. The machine stopped, but then the whole factory was filled with that burnt rubber smell again, less stronger this time. I ran back to the control room and locked the door behind me. I called the plant manager the next morning and handed in my resignation. I told him I was uncomfortable working nights alone in the old building. He didn't ask questions. I never went back. Later, I found out from a former employee that the stamping machine had been the site of a tragic accident years ago. A worker had been caught in the machine during maintenance and died on the spot. His death was ruled accidental, but rumors said he was angry and restless. Some nights, they say, the stamping machine still works by itself, and you can hear the man's footsteps echoing in the halls. I'm not crazy, and I don't believe in ghosts, but after those nights, I'm not sure what else could explain what I heard and saw. Some things don't rest easy, especially in the dead of night. Story, the end. The night shift at the Callaway manufacturing plant was a world of its own. Unlike the chaotic, bustling days filled with supervisors barking orders and the constant hum of machines, the nights were quieter, eerily quiet. Most of the workers preferred the day, but some, like Tony, found a strange comfort in the solitude the graveyard shift offered. The night shift was Tony's life for nearly 4 years, and it had worn on him more than he ever expected. Tony's job was simple in theory: oversee the automated packaging line, make sure the machines were running smoothly, and intervene only when there was a mechanical failure. His shift started at 11 p.m. and ended at 7 a.m. The factory was located on the outskirts of a small town, surrounded by empty fields that stretched toward the horizon like dark, waiting jaws. The building itself was old, made of brick and steel, with large industrial windows that showed nothing but blackness during Tony's hours. At first, the nights were uneventful: the hum of the machines, the blinking lights on the control panels, and the occasional footsteps of the maintenance crew. But over time, Tony began to notice subtle changes, things that didn't make sense. One night, about a month after he'd started, Tony was walking down the long corridor toward the break room when he heard faint tapping noises coming from the far end of the factory floor. It sounded like someone knocking on metal pipes, slow and steady. The tapping didn't match any of the machinery rhythms, and no one was supposed to be working that late except him. He called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" but got no reply. The taps stopped. Shrugging, he kept walking, but the silence felt heavier. The lights overhead flickered for a moment, and a cold draft ran down the corridor, despite the heaters humming nearby. Tony shook it off, telling himself it was just the old building settling. Over the next several weeks, the odd noises grew more frequent. Sometimes it was the tapping. Other times it was the metallic clang of tools dropping where no one was working. Once he thought he saw a shadow dart past one of the large windows that faced the empty fields. But when he looked outside, nothing was there except the dim glow of distant street lamps. Tony mentioned these things to his coworker Dave, who worked the previous shift and would sometimes stay late to finish his reports. Dave laughed it off, suggesting that Tony was just stressed, or maybe the building was haunted. "Probably just rats or wind," Dave said one night. "Or maybe your imagination's getting the better of you." Tony wanted to believe that too. But the events escalated. One night, while monitoring the control panel near the packaging line, Tony noticed something strange on the screens. The sensors were picking up movement in sections of the factory that were supposed to be shut down. Cameras showed empty conveyor belts, no workers, no equipment moving, nothing. But the sensors kept triggering alarms. Tony walked over to the section in question, the old storage wing that hadn't been used for years. The doors there were heavy steel, often locked. He pulled out his access card and swiped it to open the door. Inside was darkness and silence. But then he felt it, a presence. Tony's skin prickled. His breath quickened. He called out softly, "Hello?" A soft whisper responded from the far corner. "Help." Tony froze. He flicked on his flashlight and aimed it toward the voice. The beam landed on an empty shelf. No one was there. The voice came again. "Help me." The words echoed around the room, barely louder than a breath. Tony hurried out, locking the door behind him. After that night, Tony stopped going near the storage wing. But it didn't stop there. Several nights later, Tony was sitting in the control room when the power flickered, and the monitors went black for a few seconds. When they came back on, one of the cameras showed a figure standing near the packaging line, a tall man in a long coat, face obscured by shadows. Tony's heart pounded. He called security, but when guards arrived, the figure was gone. The building was empty. Tony tried to rationalize it, perhaps a glitch in the cameras or an employee who had forgotten to clock out, but no one was found. The atmosphere grew heavier. The cold spots appeared in different rooms, equipment turned on by itself, whispered voices on empty radio channels. Tony's sleep became restless and his days were foggy. One particularly stormy night, the emergency alarm blared without cause, waking everyone on site. Tony and the security team rushed to check for fires or intruders, but found nothing. In the aftermath, Tony was ordered to remain calm and continue his duties. But that night was the breaking point. While doing his rounds, Tony passed the old storage wing again. The heavy steel doors were slightly ajar. He stared at them, an overwhelming urge pulling him inside. He tried to resist, but felt compelled to enter. Inside, the air was frigid. The flashlight's beam caught faded graffiti on the walls and old boxes long forgotten. Then he saw it, a figure standing perfectly still in the shadows. Tony froze. The figure turned slowly. Its face was pale, eyes sunken, mouth twisted into a silent scream. Tony's knees buckled. He backed out, almost tripping, and slammed the door shut. After that night, Tony didn't return to the factory. He left the job and moved to another city, never speaking about what happened. But sometimes in the dead of night, Tony wakes up to tapping sounds on his apartment walls. The tapping is slow, steady, and always 3 knocks. He never answers. Story the end. Working the night shift was supposed to be temporary, a stopgap until I figured out something better. The factory job paid the bills, and I was grateful for that. But looking back, the months I spent working those late hours are some of the most unsettling times of my life. The factory was located on the edge of a small town, a sprawling, aging complex that had once been a bustling hub for manufacturing. Now, most of it was automated, and the night shift was a skeleton crew tasked mainly with monitoring machines and handling minor maintenance. The place always smelled faintly of grease and old wood, with the occasional cold draft that seeped through cracks in the walls. My first night started quietly enough. I clocked in around 10 p.m., met the small team of night workers, 3 other guys, and settled into the routine. It was mostly boring. Checking gauges, recording temperatures, making sure conveyor belts kept moving. But the factory had a strange atmosphere at night. The hum of machines mixed with the silence made everything feel surreal. After a few weeks, I noticed little things that didn't make sense. Doors would be found unlocked or slightly open when I was certain I had closed them. Sometimes the monitors would flicker, showing static, then a shadowy figure would appear for a second before disappearing. The guys on shift joked about ghosts, but I tried to shrug it off. One night around 2 a.m., I was doing a routine walk near the older part of the factory that hadn't been renovated. The hallway was dimly lit and smelled of rust and dust. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered violently and went out, plunging the corridor into darkness. I pulled out my phone's flashlight and shone it ahead. At the far end of the hallway, I saw something. A man, or maybe a silhouette of one, standing still. His features were indistinct, but I could see his head tilt slowly toward me. A chill ran down my spine, and I called out, but there was no answer. When I blinked and looked again, the figure was gone. I hurried back to the control room and told the others, but they brushed it off as a prank or my imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The following week, during the graveyard shift, one of the other workers, Greg, disappeared. He was an older guy who had been working nights for years. One morning, the day shift crew found his locker untouched and his workstation was clean. No sign he had been there the previous night. We reported it, but no leads surfaced. Security footage showed Greg arriving at work as usual, but no footage of him leaving. It was like he vanished into thin air. That incident shook all of us. The atmosphere felt heavier, and none of us wanted to be alone in the factory. I started carrying pepper spray and kept my phone close at all times. Weeks passed, and strange things kept happening. Machines would shut down randomly, alarms would blare with no cause, and unexplained noises echoed in the empty halls. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of a shadow darting just out of view. One particularly unsettling night, I was alone on the floor. The others had called out sick or quit after Greg's disappearance. Around 3 a.m., I was inspecting a large machine when the power suddenly cut off. The emergency lights flickered on, bathing the factory in a dim red glow. Then from the dark, I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. My heart pounded. I shone my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam caught nothing. The footsteps stopped just behind me. I turned quickly, but no one was there. I started to walk away, but a cold breath brushed my neck. I spun again, my voice barely a whisper as I asked, "Who's there?" Silence. Then the machines all started up at once with a deafening roar. I dropped my flashlight and it shattered on the floor. Panic took over. I ran toward the exit, fumbling with my keycard. The door was locked. I frantically swiped my card, heart racing, and finally the door clicked open. I didn't stop running until I was outside in the cold night air. I told the supervisors what happened, but they dismissed it as stress or fatigue. A few others admitted to hearing odd noises or feeling uneasy, but none would talk openly about what might be causing it. Eventually, I quit. I couldn't stay in a place that felt so wrong. Even now, months later, I can't explain what I experienced. Working the night shift at that factory wasn't just a job. It was a journey into something beyond understanding, a place where the past lingered like a shadow, and where the night revealed truths best left unseen. Story the end. The city hospital's night shift was a world apart from the bustle of the daytime. For Mark, who worked as a security guard there, the quiet hours between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. were always a mix of boredom, unease, and an undercurrent of something unexplainable. The hospital was massive, a labyrinth of sterile hallways, dimly lit rooms, and the constant hum of machines. By day, the place was full of life, patients, doctors, visitors. But at night, it was a different beast entirely. Mark had taken the job because it paid well and required little experience. He enjoyed the solitude, but quickly learned that the hospital had its own rhythm after hours. The occasional paging announcement, the beep of monitors, the distant wail of ambulances, it all became background noise. Yet over time, he started noticing things that unsettled him. On his third week, as he did his rounds on the third floor, he passed the old wing of the hospital, an area with aging rooms and faded wallpaper. Most of these rooms were empty or shut down, but room 312 caught his eye. The door was slightly cracked open, and he could see an old man sitting in a chair near the window, staring out, but seemingly unaware of Mark's presence. Mark nodded and moved on, but something about the man's vacant gaze disturbed him. That night, in the security office, Mark reviewed the surveillance footage and noticed something odd. At precisely midnight, a shadow moved down the hallway past room 312. The figure was blurred and indistinct, but it lingered longer than a passing person normally would. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. Over the next few nights, things got stranger. Doors that were locked during rounds would be found open. Lights flickered in empty rooms. Footsteps echoed down hallways with no one in sight. And always the feeling that someone or something was watching. One night, Mark was making his way through the ICU corridor when he heard a faint whisper. It was so soft he almost missed it, but the words were clear. "Help me." He stopped, looking around, but no one was there. The monitors beeped steadily, machines hummed, but the hallway was empty. That same night, he caught the sound of soft humming, like a lullaby, coming from the old wing. Curious and apprehensive, Mark followed the sound to room 312. The door was closed now, and when he knocked, there was no answer. He tried the handle, and it had opened with a creak. Inside, the room was empty, except for a small music box sitting on the bedside table. The humming seemed to come from it, though the box wasn't moving. Mark reached out and touched it, and the humming stopped abruptly. As he turned to leave, the room plunged into darkness. The lights flickered out, and Mark's heart pounded in his chest. In the dim light of his flashlight, he saw a figure standing by the window, a pale woman with hollow eyes staring directly at him. She raised a hand and pointed toward the door, then vanished. Mark fled the room and locked the door behind him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The next day, Mark asked the hospital staff about the old wing. They told him that a nurse named Eleanor had died there decades ago, under mysterious circumstances. Some said she was still trapped in the building, watching over the patients she once cared for. Mark started carrying the music box with him during his shifts, hoping it would calm the restless spirit. But the encounters became more frequent. He heard footsteps behind him, whispers calling his name, and sometimes, in the quietest moments, the faint scent of lavender, the same scent nurses said Eleanor wore. One night, Mark's radio crackled to life with a voice barely above a whisper. "Help me." He called out, but no one answered. Terrified, Mark quit the job a week later. Even now, years afterward, he sometimes dreams of that pale woman, her hollow eyes full of sorrow, reaching out from the shadows. Story the end. The night shift job at the manufacturing plant was supposed to be straightforward. I was hired as a quality control technician. My task was to check the finished products for defects, report any issues, and keep the assembly lines moving smoothly. The plant operated 24 hours, split into 3 shifts. I was assigned to the night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. They paid a little extra for working those hours, and I needed the money. What I didn't expect was how unsettling the nights could get. The plant was huge, one of those sprawling industrial complexes with rows upon rows of machines, conveyor belts, and storage areas. Most of it was automated, but there were always workers around to keep everything running, fix machines, or inspect the products. The day shift was busy and loud, but once night came, the place transformed. The hum of machines slowed down, many conveyor belts stopped, and the only people left were the night crew, a handful of operators, security guards, and me. The first couple of weeks were normal. I'd walk my sections, check the product lines, fill in my reports, and take breaks in the cramped break room. But as I got deeper into my schedule, strange things began to happen. One night, about a week in, I was making rounds near the packaging area. It was dark, with just emergency lights and a few flickering overhead lamps. I heard a sudden loud clang, like a metal bin falling over, coming from the storage room beside me. I called out, but no one answered. When I checked, nothing was out of place. The bin was upright, the shelves untouched. I shrugged it off as the wind or some machine malfunction. A few nights later, the security guard, an older guy named Mike, told me he'd seen a figure walking near the east wing after hours. It wasn't any of the workers, he said, because they all clocked out hours earlier. He described the figure as tall, wearing an old-style jumpsuit, face obscured. When Mike approached, the figure vanished into thin air. I laughed at first, but after a while, I started hearing footsteps following me in empty halls. Not just my own, but quick, light steps, like someone running, then stopping suddenly when I turned around. Every time I checked, there was no one. One night, I was working late in the quality control lab, reviewing product defects on a computer. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out entirely. Emergency lights clicked on, bathing the room in a red glow. I tried the backup generator switch, but nothing happened. I heard soft breathing close to me, but when I looked around, the room was empty. Panicking slightly, I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the exit. As I passed the window near the lab door, I saw a face staring back at me. Pale, expressionless, eyes dark and hollow. I yelped and ran, locking myself in the break room until the power was restored. After that, the incidents got worse. I started hearing whispers near the maintenance tunnels, quiet voices murmuring, sometimes calling out names. One night I heard my own name whispered repeatedly from the darkness. The air grew cold, and the hairs on my neck stood up. I tried to follow the voices, but always ended up back where I started, disoriented. My coworkers noticed I was on edge. One of them, Lisa, said she had dreams of someone watching her, and once she woke up to find a cold hand on her shoulder, but no one was there. The weirdest event happened on a stormy night. The plant had lost power completely for almost an hour. The emergency generators kicked in, but many machines remained dead. I was tasked with checking the backup systems. As I walked through the plant's old basement tunnels, I felt a presence behind me. I turned sharply, but no one was there. Suddenly, I heard a chilling, guttural growl from deep within the tunnels. It wasn't human. The sound echoed, bouncing off the concrete walls. I froze, heart pounding. I ran as fast as I could back to the surface, the growls chasing me in my mind. When I burst into the light, the security guard was waiting. He told me to call it a night. The next day, I asked about the tunnels. Mike said the old part of the plant was built on the site of a former factory that had a terrible accident decades ago, a fire that trapped workers inside. Some said the site was cursed. I didn't want to believe it, but the fear wouldn't leave me. The final straw came 2 weeks later. I was working alone, checking a machine on the far side of the plant. The lights flickered again and went out. I heard a whisper directly behind me say, "Leave." I spun around. Nothing. I took a step back, and the door slammed shut hard, locking me inside the room. I rattled the handle, my breath coming fast. Minutes later, the power returned and the door clicked open. I walked out as fast as I could and handed in my resignation the next day. I still get chills thinking about those nights, the footsteps, whispers, and eyes watching from the shadows. I don't regret quitting, but sometimes I wonder if the plant ever really stops haunting its night workers. Story the end. The night shift had always been something I viewed as a temporary gig, something to get me through until I figured out what I really wanted to do. I landed a job as a security guard at a large warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was a sprawling complex with vast open spaces, rows of towering shelves filled with boxes, and long, echoing corridors. The warehouse mostly operated during the day, but the night shift was there to monitor security, handle inventory checks, and keep an eye out for any trouble. My first few nights were dull, just walking the same paths, checking the same doors, watching grainy surveillance footage, and logging the usual. The air was always cold and smelled faintly of oil and cardboard. The place felt enormous at night, the silence broken only by the hum of the overhead lights and the distant hum of refrigeration units. I was alone most nights, save for the occasional truck driver dropping off shipments or the maintenance guy who came in to check the machines. One night, about 2 weeks into the job, I started noticing odd things. Around 2 a.m., the lights near aisle 7 flickered briefly, but when I got there, nothing was out of place. The security cameras in that section showed empty shelves. I shrugged it off, maybe an electrical glitch. Then, a couple of nights later, I was walking the same aisle when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, expecting to see a coworker or a late-night visitor, but the aisle was empty. The footsteps stopped as soon as I stopped moving. I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks, but the incidents became more frequent. Doors would sometimes be unlocked in the morning when I was sure I'd locked them the night before. I'd see shadows darting across camera feeds, only to disappear when I switched to live view. One night, I was sitting in the security office monitoring the feeds when the screen on aisle 10 suddenly went black. When it returned, a blurry figure was standing at the end of the aisle, a silhouette of a man in an old-fashioned uniform. The figure just stood there, motionless, before disappearing. I asked around during the day, and one of the older employees told me a story that chilled me. The warehouse had been built in the 1950s on the site of an old factory. Years ago, a worker had died in a machinery accident. He was a night shift worker who was caught in the conveyors after his supervisor left him alone. Since then, some employees claim to have seen him roaming the aisles, especially during the graveyard shift. That night, I resolved to keep my distance from aisles 7 and 10, but the warehouse seemed to pull me there. One night, while doing my rounds near aisle 10, I heard the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against metal, like machinery being forced to move. The area was supposed to be shut down at night. I flicked on my flashlight and slowly approached the source of the sound. As I reached the end of the aisle, the lights flickered and went out entirely, plunging me into darkness. The only thing illuminating the space was my flashlight, casting long, jittery shadows. Suddenly, I felt a cold breeze brush past me, though the windows and doors were all sealed shut. The scraping stopped. I shone my light around nervously, and that's when I saw it. A pair of eyes reflecting the flashlight beam at the far end of the aisle. The eyes blinked slowly, then vanished. My heart was pounding. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. I rushed back to the security office, locked the door, and sat down shaking. After that night, I was jumpy. Every creak, Every shadow, every flicker of light made me jump. The footsteps followed me from aisle to aisle. Sometimes I'd hear muffled voices over the radio static, though no one else was on. One particularly stormy night, the power went out across the entire facility. The emergency generators kicked in, but the whole place was cloaked in an eerie red glow. The cameras went dead. I grabbed my flashlight and began a manual check. As I walked the long corridor toward aisle 7, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, heavy, deliberate. I stopped and spun around, but no one was there. My breath came out in shaky puffs in the cold air. Suddenly, a faint, raspy voice whispered my name. Jason. I froze. The voice was unmistakably human, but hollow, as if it came from far away. I called out, "Who's there?" But only silence answered. I wanted to leave, but something compelled me to move forward. As I approached the loading dock near aisle 7, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath formed clouds in the air. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing near a stack of pallets. The shape didn't move but seemed to watch me. I raised my flashlight, but it flickered and died. In the brief darkness, I heard the scraping sound again, louder this time, followed by the distinct sound of a man gasping for air. When the flashlight blinked back on, the figure was gone. I fled back to the security office and locked myself inside until the morning shift arrived. I handed in my resignation that day. I couldn't explain what I had experienced, but I knew I couldn't stay. Years later, I passed by the warehouse. It was still there, old and weathered, but the night shift workers had dwindled. They say sometimes you can still hear footsteps echoing through the aisles and the scraping of metal in the dead of night. Some things don't rest easy, especially those who worked through the night and never got to go home. Story the end. Working the night shift at a small-town hospital was supposed to be straightforward, a quiet way to make some extra money during the graveyard hours. I had no illusions it would be glamorous, mostly paperwork, vitals checks, and occasional emergencies. But nothing prepared me for what I would experience during those long, lonely nights. I was a certified nursing assistant, freshly hired, assigned to the medical surgical unit on the 3rd floor. The hospital was a relic, with peeling paint in the hallways and flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed incessantly. Even during the day, it felt tired, but at night it was different, like the building exhaled a heavy breath, settling into something darker. The first few nights passed quietly, though the silence was sometimes unnerving. The halls stretched endlessly in both directions, interrupted only by closed doors to patient rooms. Occasionally, a nurse or doctor would pass by, their footsteps echoing softly. The old floorboards creaked underfoot, sometimes louder than necessary. You quickly learned to move carefully, to avoid the eerie sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. I worked the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. At first, I would chat with other night staff during breaks in the small lounge, sharing stories and jokes to keep awake. But after a week or so, something changed. The conversations grew quieter, more tense, as if everyone was reluctant to talk about the odd things happening in the hospital after dark. One night, around 1:30 a.m., I was doing rounds when I noticed the oxygen monitor outside room 312 was blinking erratically. The patient inside was a woman in her 70s recovering from pneumonia. The monitor should have been steady. I knocked gently on the door. No answer. I tried the door handle. It was locked. I called out softly, "Mrs. Lang, are you okay?" Silence. Then a faint shuffling noise came from inside, like someone moving slowly. I alerted the nurse in charge and asked her to bring a key. When she arrived, she unlocked the door. We entered together. Mrs. Lang was sitting up in bed, staring blankly ahead. Her breathing was shallow but steady. She looked confused. "What happened?" I asked. "I thought I heard voices," she murmured. We checked the room thoroughly. Nothing unusual. No other staff, no visitors. Just the steady hum of the machines. That night left me unsettled. A few nights later, I was walking down the long hallway toward the nurse's station when I heard footsteps behind me. Soft, deliberate, matching my pace exactly. I turned suddenly, expecting to see a colleague, but the corridor was empty. I looked up and down, but no one was there. The air felt colder, heavier. I brushed it off as exhaustion. But that was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, strange things happened regularly. Doors would open and close by themselves. Lights flickered without explanation. The PA system sometimes broadcasted faint whispers or static that sounded almost like voices. One night, I was working alone on the floor because several nurses were out sick. Around 3 a.m., the power went out briefly. The emergency lights kicked in, casting eerie red glows down the hallways. I grabbed a flashlight and started checking on patients. When I reached room 305, I heard a soft crying. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the room was empty. I called out, but no response. Then I saw it, a small rocking chair moving slowly back and forth, though there was no breeze. My heart raced. I blinked and the chair stopped. I quickly closed the door and moved on. That same night, I found an old photograph tucked inside a patient's chart. It was black and white, faded, showing a group of nurses and doctors standing in front of the hospital. I recognized a few faces, the hospital director, the head nurse, but one figure was blurred out, almost like they had been erased. I showed it to a colleague who told me that decades ago, a young nurse had died mysteriously in the hospital, her body never found. Stories circulated among the staff about her ghost wandering the halls at night. I began to wonder if the strange happenings were connected. One night, the strangest thing happened to me. I was returning from the supply closet on the other end of the floor when I felt a presence behind me. I turned, but no one was there. Then, I heard a voice whisper my name. It was faint, almost a breath. I froze. "Who's there?" I asked, voice trembling. No answer. I hurried back to the nurse's station and locked myself in. My hands shook as I called security, but the radio was dead. I was alone. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. At dawn, when the day staff arrived, I told them everything. Some smiled knowingly. One older nurse said, "You're not the first to hear her. Just be careful. I never worked nights again after that. But sometimes, late at night, when I close my eyes, I can still hear that whisper." Story the end. It was the kind of job nobody really wanted, but someone had to do it. Working the night shift as a security guard at the sprawling abandoned textile mill had become the sole means of income for Jake. He wasn't a superstitious guy, but after the first few weeks of his shift, that conviction was starting to waver. The mill had shut down more than a decade ago, leaving behind a skeleton of rusted machines, creaking metal beams, and stacks of dusty boxes. It was set for demolition soon, but until then, it sat in a state of quiet decay on the edge of town. The owners hired night security to prevent squatters or vandals from setting the place on fire or stealing what little equipment remained. Jake worked 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. alone in a small booth at the main gate, monitoring several cameras scattered throughout the premises. The cameras were old and grainy, some had dead pixels, and a few angles were completely blind spots. Still, it was his only line of defense. His days off were spent trying to forget the long stretches of silence, broken only by the wind whistling through broken windows or the occasional rat scurrying near the dumpster. At first, it was easy to chalk up the noises to the old building settling, but the nights grew darker, and so did the occurrences. One night, just before midnight, Jake noticed movement on one of the cameras, something fleeting at the far end of the warehouse. He switched the feed to zoom in, but the image was blurry. The figure seemed to be standing just out of reach of the light, motionless. Jake pressed the intercom button to announce he was checking the area, but no response came from the empty building. He grabbed his flashlight and walked toward the warehouse. The air grew colder the closer he got, and the silence deepened. No wind, no animals, just an oppressive stillness that pressed on his chest. Jake shone his flashlight over the scattered crates and piles of fabric, but found nothing out of place. The hairs on his neck stood up, and he felt eyes on him, though no one was there. He hurried back to his booth, locking the door behind him. Over the next few nights, the sightings increased. Shadows slipping past the edges of the cameras, doors banging in the distance, faint footsteps echoing across the empty hallways. Jake tried to rationalize it as the building reacting to the wind or rodents, but the feeling of being watched intensified. One night, as Jake settled into his chair around 2 a.m., he noticed on the monitor that the main warehouse door was open. The alarm system should have triggered if the door was opened without authorization, but there was no alarm. He picked up the radio and called the control center. "Door is open on Warehouse 1. Do we have a breach?" Static, then a faint crackle. "No breach detected. Check your cameras." Jake flipped through the feeds. The door was wide open, no movement inside. He grabbed his flashlight and keys, heading toward the warehouse again, heart pounding. The darkness inside was suffocating, thick with dust and the smell of mildew. Jake swept his beam across the machinery, piles of discarded cloth and rusted conveyor belts. Suddenly, a cold gust of air swept past him. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. Jake spun around, banging on the door. It was locked from the outside. His radio crackled. "Jake? Status? Locked in Warehouse 1. Door slammed shut behind me." Static. He pounded on the door with his fists, shouting for help. Minutes passed. He tried the door handle. Locked tight. His breath came in ragged gasps. Then a faint whisper echoed through the darkness. "Help me." Jake's flashlight flickered. He swung it around frantically. The whisper grew louder, clearer. "Help me." Suddenly, a shadowy figure emerged from the corner of the warehouse. It was tall, with indistinct features, almost transparent. Jake stumbled back, tripping over a crate. The figure moved toward him slowly, the whispering turning into a chilling wail. Jake screamed, pounding the door again. At the last moment before the figure reached him, the door crashed open. Ross, the day shift security guard, appeared, breathless. "Jake, you okay?" Jake scrambled out, gasping for air. I saw something." Ross frowned. "That place gets to people. It's haunted by the workers who died when the mill shut down." Jake shivered. "That's just a story." But the fear lingered. The rest of his shifts passed in a blur. Lights flickered, cameras showed static figures, and the whispers never stopped. On his final night, Jake decided he couldn't stay any longer. As he packed up, he noticed a message scrawled on a dusty window in the warehouse, written in what looked like old, faded blood. "Don't leave us." He ran. Never looked back. Years later, Jake still wakes up in the night, hearing faint knocks and whispers, wondering if the souls trapped in the mill will ever find peace. Story the end. The night shift was supposed to be just a temporary gig, a way to keep the rent paid while I figured out what I wanted to do with my life. I had no illusions about working at the manufacturing plant on the edge of town. It was loud, cold, and the kind of place where time seemed to stretch endlessly during the hours when most people were asleep. But what I didn't expect was how that stillness could make you feel like you were the only living thing left in the world. And that maybe, just maybe, you weren't. I started in early autumn when the leaves had just begun to turn and the nights were growing longer. My shift started at 11 p.m., and the plant's massive steel doors slammed shut behind me, cutting off the daylight and any sense of normalcy. The plant was an old place, with peeling paint and long hallways lined with machines that seemed ancient but somehow still hummed with power. I was assigned to the quality control team, which basically meant walking the floor every hour or so, checking machines, making sure production didn't stop, and jotting down any issues. On my first few nights, the plant felt like a different world. The day crew were gone, leaving a ghostly echo of their footsteps and chatter. My coworkers were friendly enough, but tired. A mix of night owls and people who needed the extra cash. We all shared stories about strange noises, weird shadows, and the odd things that happened when the lights flickered. At first, I laughed it off as stories to pass the time, but deep down, a knot of unease began to grow in my stomach. One night, about 2 weeks into the job, things shifted. I was walking through the weaving section, a row of giant machines with creaking metal arms and threads running like veins through the room, when the lights suddenly went out. Total blackness. My phone was dead, so I pulled out my small flashlight. As I flicked it on, the beam caught movement, a figure standing just at the edge of the corridor. The figure was tall, dressed in dark clothing, but its face was obscured in shadow. I called out, but there was no response. The figure tilted its head, then vanished as quickly as it appeared. I told myself it was a trick of the light or my eyes playing games in the dark. After that night, strange things started happening more frequently. The machines would shut down on their own, alarms blaring with no clear cause. Doors that I had locked would be found open. The radio in the control room would crackle with static, and sometimes a faint whisper would come through, a voice calling out a name, or just a low, unintelligible murmur. One of my coworkers, Miguel, told me a story about the plant's history. Apparently, years ago, there was a fire in one section of the building that had killed several workers. The factory had been rebuilt since then, but some areas were still off limits, sealed behind heavy steel doors and warning signs. No one on the night shift was supposed to go near them. Curiosity got the better of me, and one night I decided to explore. I slipped away during a break and found the door Miguel had mentioned. It was cold metal, locked tight. After a few minutes of fiddling, I managed to pry it open just enough to slip inside. The room was a dusty storage area filled with old equipment covered in tarps. The air was stale, thick with the smell of mold and rust. As I shone my flashlight around, I noticed something on the floor. Footprints in the dust, leading to a corner where a small, cracked window let in a sliver of moonlight. Suddenly, I heard a scraping noise behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. Just the silence, heavy and oppressive. I decided to leave, locking the door behind me. After that, the feelings of being watched intensified. I began to notice cold spots, areas in the plant where the air felt unnaturally chill. My dreams became restless. I would wake up in sweat, feeling as though something was standing over me. One night, during the quiet hours around 3 a.m., I was alone on the floor when I heard footsteps behind me. Not the echo of my own, but slow, deliberate steps matching my pace. I stopped and turned, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps stopped as well. I quickened my pace, heart pounding, only to hear the footsteps resume behind me. Panicked, I ran toward the exit. The emergency lights flickered on, casting red shadows that danced across the walls. As I reached the door, it slammed shut before I could grab the handle. I banged on the metal, yelling for help, but no one came. Then I heard a whisper right beside my ear. "Don't leave." The words were cold, final. Suddenly, the door unlocked with a loud click. I rushed outside into the fresh air, gasping. After that night, I quit. The factory wasn't just a building. It was a place where the past lingered, where something unseen watched from the shadows. The night shift had changed me, made me realize some places hold memories better left undisturbed. I still think about those nights, and sometimes I wonder if the things I saw were just my mind playing tricks in the dark, or if something truly haunted that factory, waiting for the next night shift worker to cross its path. Story the end. It was late August when Jamie took the night shift job at the manufacturing plant on the outskirts of town. The plant had been operating for nearly 50 years, churning out parts for heavy machinery, and the night shift was notorious among locals for being both lonely and eerie. The day crew joked about strange noises and unexplained incidents after dark, but Jamie was skeptical. After all, he just needed the paycheck, and a quiet night shift suited him well. The first few nights were uneventful, spent mostly inspecting machines, logging data, and wandering the vast warehouse floors to ensure everything was secure. The hum of the machines and the clatter of conveyor belts were oddly comforting. Jamie liked the solitude, and the hours flew by faster than he'd expected. One night, about 2 weeks into the job, things started to change. Around 1 a.m., Jamie was checking the far end of the plant near the storage area. The overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting long, shifting shadows across the stacks of metal crates. As he walked, he thought he heard faint footsteps echoing behind him, but when he spun around, the aisle was empty. He shrugged it off as his imagination or the building settling. Later that same shift, Jamie stopped near an old section of the plant that hadn't been used in years. The doors to that wing were locked and marked as off-limits, but he sometimes heard noises coming from there, clanging, muffled voices, and even what sounded like footsteps. That night, he noticed the door to the old wing was slightly ajar. Curious, he approached and peered inside. The corridor was dark, and a stale, metallic smell hung in the air. He called out, "Hello, anyone there?" No reply. A shiver ran down his spine. He stepped back and closed the door firmly. Over the next few nights, the strange occurrences intensified. Jamie would hear whispers in the empty halls, soft murmurs just beyond hearing range. Sometimes the security cameras showed shadows moving where no one was supposed to be. Doors locked tight during rounds would mysteriously be open moments later. One night, Jamie was stationed near the control room when the lights suddenly cut out. Emergency backup lights flickered on, bathing the area in a dim red glow. The factory fell silent except for the low hum of the generators. Jamie's walkie-talkie crackled with static, then a faint voice whispering, "Help me." His pulse quickened. "Who is this? Where are you?" Only static answered. Determined to figure out what was going on, Jamie grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the old wing again. This time, the door was wide open, revealing a long corridor lined with rusted machinery and peeling paint. The air was colder here, and an unnatural silence pressed in. As he walked deeper, the whispering grew louder, almost like chanting. Jamie's light caught on a figure at the far end, an outline of a man, hunched and swaying. The figure turned suddenly, revealing a face twisted with despair and anguish. Jamie froze, heart pounding. The figure let out a guttural scream before vanishing into thin air. Terrified, Jamie retreated and locked the door behind him. The next day, he asked a senior employee about the old wing. The man's face grew grim. That place was shut down after an accident years ago. A maintenance worker got trapped inside a machine and died. Since then, weird things have happened. Tools moving on their own, strange sounds. Folks say his spirit never left. Jamie felt a chill. That night, as he patrolled, he found the lights flickering again near the old wing. The temperature dropped sharply, and his breath misted in the air. He heard footsteps approaching rapidly, but when he turned, no one was there. The whispering voice came again, more urgent this time. "Help me. Trapped." Jamie wanted to flee but felt drawn toward the old wing. Something compelled him to return, to find a way to help the restless spirit. He spent the following days researching the accident and discovered that the worker had been alone during a routine check, trapped when a machine unexpectedly started, crushing him. Emergency responders found his body hours later, but no one ever explained why the machinery failed or why the area was left unsecured. Jamie arranged to visit the old wing with the plant manager during the day. As they explored the space, Jamie noticed a loose panel on one of the machines. Behind it, a small, rusted box was wedged in the cavity. Inside, they found a worn-out identification badge and a faded photo of the worker. Jamie felt an overwhelming sadness wash over him. He placed the items on a nearby ledge and said a silent prayer. From that night on, the disturbances ceased. The light stayed steady, the whispers faded, and the eerie, cold spots disappeared. Jamie continued working the night shift, but never forgot the silent plea for help that led him to uncover the truth. The plant remained quiet in the darkness, but sometimes, late at night, Jamie still caught a faint scent of oil and metal, a reminder that some souls linger, waiting for peace. Story the end.